This city stood for more than 3,000 years without anyone touching it. It did not need support. It did not need reinforcement. It did not need to be preserved. It remained standing because it had never been opened. Then humans returned, not with weapons, not with ambition, but with measuring tools, blueprints, and good intentions. At first, everything seemed fine. Walls emerged. Stone gates took shape. A lost capital, slowly, came back into view. But the city did not respond the way they expected. There was no collapse, no dramatic failure, only numbers beginning to change. Stress, moisture, small fractures that were never part of the original plans. They realized something. This city was not aging because of time. It was weakening because it was being exposed. For thousands of years, Hattusa had existed in a state of balance. Soil held pressure. Stone held position. Water was contained. When the soil was removed, the pressure went with it. And what remained was not history. It was risk. Every additional meter excavated did not bring new answers. It only made the city harder to keep standing. Every wall that was freed became a wall standing alone, something it was never designed to do. And then there came a moment when the archaeologists understood if they continued, Hattusa would not collapse like an ancient catastrophe. It would collapse right in front of them. For the first time, excavation was no longer the right choice. Not because they were afraid, but because they understood that some places can only continue to exist when humans do not take another step forward. Hattusa was not destroyed in the past, but it almost did not survive the present. And that was the moment they were forced to stop. Not to end the story, but so that this city could still exist after the story was told. Hattusa was not a city built to impress. It did not rise on a plain. It did not sit beside a great river. It did not open itself to strangers. It was built higher, among stone, along steep slope that resisted easy access. This was not a convenient location. It was a chosen one. The walls of Hattusa were not only for defense. They followed the terrain, bent with the hills, anchored into the rock. There were no straight lines, no grand axes, no attempt to dominate the landscape. Everything was placed where it could remain still. This city was not designed to expand endlessly. It was contained. Few gates, narrow paths, layered spaces. To go deeper, you had to slow down. Even the largest structures were never separated from the ground beneath them. Temples, storerooms, fortifications, all of them relied on the soil to exist. Not like modern foundations, but like a body depending on its environment to stay balanced. Hattusa did not fight nature. It negotiated with it. For centuries, rain fell, water seeped. The ground expanded and contracted, yet the city did not fail. Not because it was stronger, but because it was never detached from the system that sustained it. When people left, the city did not die. It simply shifted into another state, one that did not require light, did not require access, did not require explanation. The soil took over, covering, holding pressure, stabilizing what remained. Not quickly, not violently, just time continuing. And that is why Hattusa was still standing when humans returned. Not because it had been protected, but because it had not been over-interfered with. The real danger was never collapse in the ancient past. It was the modern assumption that everything must be seen. Hattusa was built to endure without being observed. And that single condition kept it standing longer than any empire that once ruled it. The question now is no longer what this city once was, but what conditions does it need to continue existing? If you listen closely, the question has already shifted. It is no longer what is still buried beneath Hattusa. It has become, what are we doing when we try to bring everything to the surface? The change did not begin with a collapse. It began with removal. At first, the soil was lifted carefully, measured, documented, cleared with intention. Each layer taken away revealed more of the city and removed something else at the same time. What disappeared was not history. It was pressure. For centuries, the weight of the earth had been part of the structure, not an obstacle, a support. It held walls in place, limited movement, slowed water. When that weight was gone, the city was asked to stand in a way it never had before. At the surface, nothing dramatic happened. The walls remained upright. The gates still stood, but beneath them, forces were redistributing. Quietly, water found new paths. Rain reached places it had never touched. Moisture collected where evaporation was slow. Then came cold, expansion, contraction, cycles the city had never experienced in this exposed state. Instruments began to record it. Not opinions, not theories. Data. Stress line appeared where none had existed. Stone blocks shifted by millimeters. Enough to matter. Enough to tell a story no one wanted to hear yet. The deeper the excavation went, the clearer the pattern became. This was not damage caused by age. It was damage caused by access. Every wall uncovered lost the lateral support it once relied on. Every corridor opened became a channel for air and water. What had been stable as part of a buried system became fragile as an isolated object. There was no single moment when someone said, "Stop." Instead, there were meetings, reports, comparisons between seasons. The conclusion formed slowly, uncomfortably. If excavation continued at this scale, the city would not fail in the distant future. It would fail within observable time. Hattusa was not collapsing because it was weak. It was collapsing because it was being asked to exist outside the conditions it was built for. This was the contradiction. To study the city, it had to be exposed. But to survive, it had to remain partially buried. For archaeologists, this created a line they had rarely faced before. Knowledge on one side, irreversible law on the other. Continuing meant answers, but it also meant accepting responsibility for what those answers would destroy. And for the first time, the excavation itself became the threat. Not looters, not time, not nature, us. This was not a failure of science. It was a limit, a realization that some cities are not meant to be fully revealed. That understanding everything can sometimes mean preserving less. By the end of this phase, Hattusa was no longer just an ancient capital. It was a warning, a city that had survived collapse of empires, drought, abandonment, 3,000 years of silence, only to be destabilized by the act of being understood. What followed was not an emergency response. It was something much harder, a deliberate decision to step back. They did not return once. They came back again and again. Each season brought new teams, new permits, new questions, and the same assumption that what had worked before could continue. The excavations expanded. More ground was cleared. More walls were exposed. More corridors were opened. Not recklessly, carefully. Scaffolding was added. Drainage channels were cut. Protective coverings were installed. All signs of responsible work. The city began to change in visible ways, not collapsing, but separating. Walls that had once leaned against earth now leaned against air. Stone surfaces that had never seen sunlight were suddenly asked to endure it. Paths formed where none had existed. Foot traffic, wind, water. The city, once part of a closed system, was becoming a collection of objects. Access improved. So did exposure. Measurements continued. Data was collected. Seasonal reports showed patterns, but nothing dramatic enough to stop the work. There was still time. That belief held. Restoration followed excavation. Some stones were reset. Some joints were reinforced. But each intervention created a new dependency. The city was no longer simply ancient. It was now managed. And management requires maintenance. Constantly. The problem was not that the work was careless. The problem was that the city had crossed a threshold. It was no longer stable on its own. It was stable only as long as humans remained involved. And that question, whether they could remain involved forever, had not yet been asked. At this stage, no one was talking about stopping. They were still talking about solutions. The decision to stop had not arrived yet, but the conditions that would force it were already in place. There was no collapse, no moment when someone had to shout that everything was going wrong. What was happening was too small to be called an emergency. The wall did not fall. They only shifted slightly. The cracks did not suddenly widen. They simply remained longer than expected. Water did not rush in. It seeped, slowly, silently, again and again. There was no instrument designed to detect a city approaching the point of no return. Every change could be explained. Every season had its own justification. And because of that, no season was ever considered the last. This is how ancient systems are undone, not by a single major mistake, but by many small decisions that all seemed reasonable at the moment they were made. No one intended to damage Hattusa. No one worked carelessly. But this city was never meant to endure constant observation. It was not built to exist in a state of permanent exposure, always being monitored, always being measured, always being adjusted. What kept Hattusa standing was not timely intervention. It was the absence of intervention. And when that absence disappeared, there was no clear signal to warn what would follow. Only a stable state, slowly being undone, quietly, irreversibly. The problem was not that we failed to understand what was happening. The problem was this: by the time we realized we understood too much, there was no longer enough time to return to the way things had been. Hattusa did not warn humanity with disaster. It warned us with prolonged silence. And that is the kind of warning humans usually recognize only after most choices have already narrowed. By this point, the problem was no longer technical. There were still solutions. More supports, better drainage, stronger reinforcements. On paper, everything could be stabilized. But each solution came with a cost that could not be reversed. Every intervention altered the site. Every reinforcement replaced something original. Every correction changed the very thing they were trying to protect. The question was no longer, how do we excavate safely? It became, how much of the city can be changed before it is no longer the city itself? The archaeologists began to understand something uncomfortable. Digging further did not mean understanding more. In fact, Each additional step revealed less because it erased the conditions that made the city intelligible in the first place. Preservation and exposure were no longer aligned. To show more was to lose more. To access more was to risk what could never be replaced. This was not a failure of planning. It was not hesitation. It was a recognition of limits. For the first time, the responsible choice was not to proceed. Not because of fear, not because of public pressure, but because continuing would mean accepting the full responsibility for irreversible loss. The decision was not dramatic. Work slowed. Some areas were closed again. Others were deliberately reburied. Access was restricted, not as an admission of defeat, but as an act of restraint. Hattusa would not be fully revealed. Not in this generation. Possibly not ever. And that choice was not made to protect ruins. It was made to protect meaning. Because once a site depends entirely on constant human management to remain standing, it is no longer an archaeological record. It is a reconstruction. At Hattusa, they chose to draw the line before that happened. They chose to stop, not because the past was out of reach, but because preserving it required leaving parts of it untouched. The hardest decision was not ending the excavation. It was accepting that some knowledge must remain incomplete. By this point, the story is no longer about Hattusa. The walls have already told us what they can. The measurements are complete. The risks are understood. What remains is not an archaeological problem. It is a human one. For generations, we have believed that uncovering is the same as understanding. That exposure leads to knowledge. That nothing truly matters until it can be seen. But Hattusa challenges that assumption. Because this city survived precisely because it was not visible. Because it remained part of a system larger than itself. Once removed from that system, it did not become clear. It became fragile. So the question changes. It is no longer, what else is still buried here? It becomes, what should remain buried so that something can continue to exist? This is not a question about excavation. It is a question about restraint, about whether every answer is worth the cost of obtaining it, about whether curiosity has a limit, and whether recognizing that limit is a weakness or a responsibility. Hattusa does not demand that we stop learning. It asks something harder, that we learn how to leave certain things as they are, that we accept that some parts of the past are not incomplete. They are simply not meant to be fully possessed. And perhaps the most important knowledge we gain from places like this is not what they reveal, but what they ask us not to take. Hattusa is still there, not fully revealed, not fully explained, and because of that, still standing. Some parts remain buried, not because they were forgotten, but because they were understood well enough to be left alone. This is not an ending. That offers closure. It offers something else. A reminder that preservation is sometimes an act of restraint, that choosing not to know everything can be a form of care, and that the past does not always ask to be uncovered. Sometimes it asks to be respected.